So new polling from Angus Reid indicates that since 2016, there's been a sharp increase in the support for proportional representation in Canada. But what's really interesting here is not just the sharp increase in general, but how it's reflected across every major political party and across every province in this country. That's absolutely vital to note. If you recall, back in 2015, Justin Trudeau promised to end first past the post forever. He won a majority under first past the post and broke his promise. Liberals will try to make excuses till the cows come home about that, but at the end of the day, Justin Trudeau lied because he wanted to preserve a broken system, because it was that system that gave him power. And in this most recent election, as many as 43% of Liberals were strategic voters, showing that even though the Liberals lost some ground and lost their majority in 2019, perhaps the major reason they're still in power at all is because of the broken electoral system that holds millions of Canadian voters hostage to the Liberal Party each and every election. And so you can see that in this most recent poll, more and more Canadians see this as a broken model. They see it as a model that doesn't allow people to vote for the parties they want. They see it as a model that might give power to the party that doesn't even win the most votes, as we saw in this election. Whatever you think of the Conservatives, they have more support than the Liberals. And so this system is broken at representing the will of the people, especially when one party wins a majority and gets all the power. But even in minority governments, it can distort the actual level of support for the various parties. For instance, the NDP is underrepresented, the Greens woefully underrepresented, and of course, the Liberals overrepresented, and the Conservatives sort of more or less where they should be, but not having as many seats as the Liberals, even though they got more votes. But let's look at the data, because it really shows the stark increase in support for proportional representation in general, but also across the parties and regions. So at the beginning of 2016, basically half of Canadians, a little less, supported electoral reform. Now that number is over 2/3, just over 2/3 at 68. But let's look at all the parties. Across every party, you've seen growing support for electoral reform. But the party that's seen the biggest growth in terms of support for electoral reform is the Conservative Party. In 2016, barely a quarter of Conservatives supported it. Now, nearly 70% do, well above the Liberals. Liberal support, even though they've benefited from the broken first-past-the-post system, continue to support electoral reform and have actually gone up a little bit in their support. And amongst the NDP and Greens, you've seen growing support quite a bit, which is doubly impressive given that the level of support was already quite high. And finally, even the Bloc Québécois supports it. Under our current system, the Bloc Québécois tends to benefit when you look at the national numbers, but because proportional representation would likely be contained within a province-by-province basis, because shifting power between provinces would require constitutional reform, Bloc supporters like the idea that if the Bloc gets 30% of the Quebec vote, they should get 30% of the Quebec seats. And I think at the end of the day, what this shows is that in 2019, there is cross-party unanimity on this issue. A significant amount of supporters of every party supports proportional representation, not ranked ballots, not any other kind of superficial reform, proportional representation. And let's look at the numbers at the provinces. Now again, if you look at the national numbers, support was just below 50%, but now it's close to 70%. And you see significant growth, especially in those provinces that feel shut out from the current result. And it's also provinces where Conservatives tend to do well. That makes sense because if the Conservatives seem to be the ones that are moving most heavily from first past the post support to proportional representation support, then you likely see higher support rising in those provinces. And so in provinces like BC, you actually see that it was one of the highest levels of support for electoral reform 3 years ago, and now it's among the lowest. But if you look everywhere, it's up. It's up in BC. It's up huge in Alberta, up huge in Saskatchewan, up noticeably in Manitoba, up reasonably high in Ontario. And even though it's not up as much in Quebec and Atlantic Canada, it's up nonetheless. No particular province has support below 60% for electoral reform. Put another way, every single province in this country supports electoral reform at a sort of supermajority level. This isn't a case of 51-49. This isn't even a case of 55-45. Supermajorities from coast to coast to coast. So there you have it. At the end of the day, Canadians, regardless of where they live and regardless of who they vote for, want to fix our broken electoral system. And the barrier to that is the liberal and conservative duopoly whose membership wants reform, but whose party elite doesn't. The Conservative Party elite doesn't want the reform, and the Liberal Party elite doesn't want the reform. But regular Canadians do. And I think that in this minority parliament, parties should work together, all parties should work together to implement a system of proportional representation that represents the needs and diversity of values that Canadians have. Until that happens, Canadians will continue to be dissatisfied with the democratic outcomes that result from our elections because the system itself is not designed to produce outcomes that match the will of the people. With a system of proportional representation, for the first time, we'll have election results that reflect the will of Canadians, whether they're liberal or conservative or NDP or Green or Bloc. It will reflect the will of the people. And isn't that what democracy ultimately is all about?